Howdy. Howdy. I'm still learning that after spending many years in the imperial capital before I came to College Station. So glad to be here, though. It's my pleasure tonight to introduce Michael Cohen and Christopher Preble, who are co-writing what I see as an after-action report on Afghanistan with Monica Duffy Toft. And they're going to talk about, I think, their story about what happened in Afghanistan. I think this is crucial as we think about whether or not we want to do this again, and if so, how do we do it better next time? This is a talk sponsored by the Scowcraft Institute for International Affairs, the Bush School's Intelligence Studies Program, and the Center for Grand Strategy. Tonight I'm representing John Schuessler, who is the co-director, and I am the other co-director of the Center for Grand Strategy, Jason Castillo. It is a pleasure to see such a big turnout. I think this is a crucial conversation to be having, and I appreciate their ability to sort of rip the Band-Aid off and allow us to engage in this conversation as we think about, you look at the globe and you think about the different conflicts out there. There's one brewing in East Asia over Taiwan. There is the conflict in the Middle East, so maybe there are multiple conflicts in the Middle East. When you look at the Middle East, I'm sort of thinking about the third Godfather movie when Michael Corleone says, "Every time I try to get out, they keep dragging me back in." And then, of course, we have the war in Ukraine and thinking about what life looks like after that war. So the way we're going to do this evening is that Christopher Preble is going to start first, and then Michael Cohen, and we're going to try to do a crisp half hour to take your questions. And we're going to take your questions by card, and I'm going to moderate them. And the reason we're doing that is because this is also going to be on the Zoom. One of the curses of the pandemic is now Zoom is everywhere. But it also allows us to broadcast to a bigger audience. Let me briefly introduce our two speakers. First is Michael Cohen, who is sitting there in the center chair. He's a non-resident senior fellow at the Center for Strategic Studies at the Fletcher School and at the Eurasia Group Foundation. You can see him on MSNBC once in a while, although I don't think I've ever seen you on Morning Joe, which is this is how I take my breakfast, so I'm irritated in the morning. And you can read him in the New Republic and the Daily Beast. He served as a speechwriter at the State Department and then for Senator Chris Dodd. Chris Preble, who I think I've known you for many years, since the ill-fated Iraq War, where we bonded over what the hell are we doing there. He is a senior fellow and director of the Reimagining U.S. Grand Strategy Program at the Stimson Center, a co-host of the Net Assessment podcast, which is actually enjoyable on my long rides from the Woodlands up to College Station. And he teaches U.S. foreign policy at the University of California, Washington Center. Every school must have a Washington Center. Even we have our Bush School teaching site. He holds a PhD in history from Temple University. Chris, please come to the podium. And at the end of the talk, papers are also available, as well as a flyer giving you an outline of the paper.
Thank you, Jason. Thank you all so much for being here. Thanks to the Scowcraft School and to John Schuessler, who wasn't able to join us, and to Jason for filling in. And we've had a great time here. And thanks so much for turning out, all of you. And for those of you watching online, I appreciate you too. Let me give a quick background on this project in terms of how we started it. Michael and I have known each other for over 15 years. We also bonded over U.S. foreign policy, and we were watching, as many of us were, the withdrawal in August of 2021 with the same amount of shock and horror as everyone else. But we quickly were concerned that there would be too much focus on August of 2021 and not enough focus on the prior 19 Augusts. This is a 20-year mission, and it did not fail in 3 months or 3 weeks. All right? So that was the motivating factor behind this project. And we decided to explore the question of U.S. involvement in Afghanistan according to 7 core assumptions I will warn you in advance. So we did not bring enough copies of the paper that every single one of you can get your hands on one of these. So if you really want the ones that I printed off on our printer back at the Simpson Center, you might want to go. But you don't have to do that. It's posted online. There are many more copies of this card, which on this card shows you the 7 core assumptions that we identified. I'm going to touch on some of these today, but my part of the talk is mostly going to be focused on the very first assumption, the assumption that America made the correct decision to use force in Afghanistan, supporting the Northern Alliance and toppling the Taliban regime. That's where I will focus most of my remarks. Michael's remarks will mostly have to do with the second assumption, which is America must never negotiate with other terrorists, thus there can be no political role for the Taliban in Afghanistan's future. The conflation of the Taliban and Al-Qaeda is a key theme in our work. But before I get to that, we all know why we're here talking about Afghanistan. We all know why the United States was in Afghanistan. Of course, the United States was in Afghanistan because of the attacks on 9/11, the attacks that were planned from Al-Qaeda camps in Afghanistan. And so remembering, and for those of you who weren't alive, trust me when I tell you that the shock and horror coming out of those attacks on September 11, 2001 was something like we had never experienced, my generation had never experienced. And it was not just the sense of shock and horror, but there was also fear of another attack or many more such attacks. And so trying to put ourselves back into that mindset when we were doing this research in these first few critical months after 9/11 was really important to this project. So like I said, we have identified these 7 core assumptions. I'm going to focus on the first few critical months after 9/11, and there were a series of policy decisions that were made quite early in those first few months that we think set the course of U.S. foreign policy for 2 decades that was very hard to change. And in fact, and in particular, there were 4 through lines in U.S. involvement that we identified. First, the clear sense that the use of military force in Afghanistan was unavoidable and even preferred. Second, U.S. officials treated Afghanistan as an abstraction. It was a venue for demonstrating American resolve. Lacking knowledge of Afghanistan and candidly not exhibiting a lot of desire to learn about it, the United States failed to make distinctions, including, we think, one of the most important was differentiating between the Taliban and Al-Qaeda, so that's 2. Third, another through line that ran not just through these first few months, but really through the 20-year period of the war. Bush administration officials believed they could alter Pakistan's strategic calculus pertaining to Afghanistan and bring their views of their interests in line with our views of our interests. That was widely believed and tragically not true. And lastly, there was a fear of becoming entangled in Afghanistan among U.S. government officials. They were wary of mission creep, and they wanted this mission to be done relatively cheaply and then to try to hand off some of the responsibilities to others and focus on other things. Because remember what I said, Afghanistan was an abstraction. This was going to be the first of many such operations to send a message to those who were responsible for the 9/11 attacks. If you do this, this is what will happen to you in return. So first, the inevitability of war. Immediately after 9/11, we know this from the moment after President Bush was notified of the attacks. He recorded this in his memoirs years later. They're going to pay. This was, he said, a declaration of war. He sort of jumped to that presumption. Now remember, before this time, we had attacks by Al-Qaeda on U.S. government facilities in 1998 in Kenya and Tanzania, and then the attack on the USS Cole in 2000. But they were not treated as acts of war. They were treated as acts of a law enforcement matter to be dealt with in the criminal justice system. So this was a key departure to think of this as an act of war, an immediate sort of putting the country on an immediate war footing. And the day after 9/11, President Bush explained, this will be a monumental struggle of good versus evil, but good will prevail. At a prayer breakfast, a prayer ceremony a few days after that, he said the American people's responsibility to history is clear, to answer these attacks and rid the world of evil. So you can tell, just in terms of the way the United States dealt with the problem of terrorism, dealt with the problem of Al-Qaeda before 9/11, how much different in just a few days the mindset was with respect to dealing with Al-Qaeda after 9/11. Many of you may have read or remember, some of you remember the speech that President Bush delivered for a joint session of Congress on September 20th. Again, the language was very black and white, good and evil. And in that respect, America's enemies were irredeemable, no quarter given. With us or against us, it was very clear, black and white. Now, part of that period of time, just in the first few days, President Bush delivered an ultimatum to the Taliban, including deliver the leaders of Al-Qaeda, release all foreign nationals, and close every terrorist training camp. But there was never much of a discussion as to whether or not they thought that was actually going to happen, and I think in many respects the presumption was that those were demands that the Taliban simply weren't going to meet, and therefore we moved to the next step, which is preparing for war. So that's the first through line. The decision to go to war, that decision was made very early on in the process, and no quarter given to any adversaries. The second through line is Afghanistan as an abstraction. Michael fixed upon this framing, which I think has come back over and over again. You may be surprised to learn that within the vast, sprawling U.S. government, the knowledge of Afghanistan was few and far between. The State Department team that was put together immediately after 9/11 for coordinating Afghanistan policy was led by Richard Haass, who was Director of Policy Planning, who admitted at the time and since that he didn't know anything about Afghanistan, but he simply was called upon to lead that effort. The Pentagon had done no contingency planning for using force in Afghanistan. Again, there had been the attacks in retaliation for the embassy bombings in 1998, but there was nothing on the shelf, so to speak, that was available immediately after, or to be put into effect after 9/11. We interviewed Richard Haass. He was very gracious to be interviewed for this project, and he explained when it comes to Afghanistan, quote, people have more prejudices than knowledge, unquote. And I think this lack of knowledge and interest in Afghan politics led the Bush administration to view this country, Afghanistan, this place, through the lens of counterterrorism. It was a venue to wage a war against terrorists. It was not a place where they were trying to understand well enough the nuances and details and intricacies of Afghanistan, and that posed challenges for U.S. policy in those first few months and subsequently. I mentioned the demands the Bush administration issued to the Taliban about turning that over, but Haass admitted that considering what had happened on 9/11, it was so traumatic and so awful, there was this disinclination to compromise with the Taliban, and this came up when a few months later the campaign was so successful in dislodging them, and Michael will talk about that. A few things about the Taliban and Al-Qaeda, though, before 9/11. The Taliban and Al-Qaeda had struck this kind of mutually beneficial alliance in Afghanistan. The Taliban provided refuge to bin Laden and his followers after they were kicked out of Sudan in 1996, and in return, Al-Qaeda provided $10 to $20 million a year in Afghanistan to the Taliban, and critically, they served as sort of shock troops, fighters for the war the Taliban was waging against the Northern Alliance. It was still a war going on, a civil war in effect, and the Al-Qaeda fighters proved quite good at that thing, and so it was a mutually beneficial alliance. But after the 9/11 attacks, Mullah Omar, the leader of the Taliban, convened a loya jirga of several advisors, and they advised him to ask bin Laden to leave the country. But he rejected that advice, and the best we can tell, he just did not believe that the United States was actually going to carry through its threat to attack the Taliban and dislodge them from power. He did not believe that was going to happen. And he had a very, almost a mystical hold over the Taliban, even though there were some within the movement who were advising him to change, to make a different decision. Once he had made his decision, that was not really challenged. So even though some in the Taliban thought bin Laden was more trouble than he was worth, he was not handed over to the United States, of course, and Omar's stubbornness is definitely part of the reason why what happened next. The third through line has to do with Pakistan, which I hinted at. Just as Afghanistan was an abstraction for the United States, so too were Pakistan's long-standing strategic interests in Afghanistan given short shrift. Islamabad had supported the Taliban for years. In fact, Pakistani support was key to the Taliban's emergence. And yet, in the immediate aftermath of 9/11, U.S. officials viewed Pakistan as the linchpin of the strategy against the Taliban. They actually, they relied on the Pakistanis to cooperate with the United States to isolate the Taliban and in turn cripple Al-Qaeda. This was, some of this is a function of habit. The supply to the anti-Soviet resistance, the Mujahideen in the 1980s came through Pakistan. There were no, the land routes from the north, of course, were in the Soviet Union. But that's a critical difference, right, is that unlike in the 1980s, in 2001, those former Soviet republics were independent states, and in fact the United States did stage some operations from the countries to the north. For us, the critical thing is the Bush administration was not paying close enough attention to what senior Pakistani officials, most importantly Pervez Musharraf, the president, was saying to his own people. In a televised speech on September 19th, Musharraf told Pakistanis that working with the United States was the most effective way to limit Indian encroachment in Afghanistan, and that Pakistan's alignment with America was a lesser evil and a temporary decision that would protect Pakistan. Never in the speech did he condemn Al-Qaeda or its actions on September 11th. And so even within the first few weeks of the U.S. mission in Afghanistan that hinged on the cooperation of the Pakistanis, there was considerable evidence that the Pakistanis were not actually bought into the United States' claims that our interests were aligned. There was considerable resistance, and we saw that play out more and more over the course of the 20-year period, the double game in effect. Lastly, there was a resistance within the Bush administration to the notion of maintaining a large military presence and replicating, the fear was of replicating the mistakes the Soviet Union had made during their decade-long occupation in the 1980s. The perception that Afghans were anti-foreigner, which meant a long presence, U.S. troops would breed anger and contempt. Haas would later write, quote, "The consensus was that little could be accomplished in Afghanistan given its history, culture, and composition, and there would be little payoff beyond Afghanistan even if things went better than expected." And we see that impulse, especially on the part of the military, to not get sucked into a long-term mission. It was very focused on a quick mission and moving on to the next thing, right? And that was even in the fall of 2001, just within a few months of the 9/11 attacks, the Pentagon was sort of had their eyes set on what's next. As some of you know, the United Nations convened a conference in Bonn, Germany. That's when the decision was made to invest Hamid Karzai as the interim president, but we focused not just on that conference, but also on the government that was created coming out of that conference. And in fact, President Karzai was saddled with a lot of people in his government who had very little personal loyalty to him, and in fact, some of them were his rivals. But there was an early effort to block an international security assistance force that had been designated at the Bonn conference for the Kabul security, a resistance or blocking of that mission, expanding beyond Kabul. Karzai wanted that desperately to spread for security elsewhere in the country, and that didn't play out. So this is an example, and there are many in the subsequent work that we've done, where U.S. objectives to get in and get out quickly conflicted with Afghan objectives, including in the idea that a negotiated settlement of any type with any members of the Taliban that would have allowed them to lay down their arms without fear of reprisal, that was also summarily rejected in December of 2001, and that's where Michael will pick up the story.
Before I begin, let me just say for the record that if any of you came here tonight hoping to hear from Donald Trump's former lawyer, I'm sorry to disappoint you. You would be shocked at how often I am confused with him. I also want to just give a quick shout out to our fellow director of the project, Monica Duffy Toft, who unfortunately was supposed to be here but could not be here tonight. She is a brilliant colleague and somebody that I just wanted to, has been integral for the process of putting together the two papers we've done so far. So where Chris left off is December of 2001. And I want to just, I think something that's perhaps not well understood about the war in Afghanistan. It began on October 7th, and it ended on around December 7th, 2 months. And in 2 months, the United States basically unseated the Taliban government and did so incredibly effectively for very few American casualties and wiped out the Taliban as a fighting force. Many of the Taliban who were not killed on the battlefield simply faded back, returned to their home villages with little interest in continuing to fight the war. This was a sweeping military and political victory of the United States. And I think it's something that it's hard to appreciate that when you think about what happened in August of 2021. But in December of 2001, the U.S. had scored what was really extraordinary and I think and completely unexpected win. Not only did most Taliban foot soldiers have zero interest in continuing to fight, the Taliban leadership was not interested in continuing to fight. In fact, there was a famous meeting that took place in December of 2001, around December 4th or 5th, near Kandahar, with Mullah Omar, who was the leader of the Taliban, with his top lieutenants. And basically the entire leadership, except for Mullah Omar, basically said, we need to surrender. They realized the game was up and they had lost. Omar opposed it, and he fled on his own, but he didn't try to stop them from pursuing a surrender agreement with the new president who'd been appointed 2 days earlier at the Bonn conference, Hamid Karzai. And I'll get to Karzai in a second, but I think it's also important to understand that the U.S. were welcomed as liberators, actually as liberators, not a hope and a dream, but they actually were welcomed as liberators. There was broad international support for the U.S. war that had been fought and support for the new Karzai government. And so the Taliban, again, understanding the writing on the wall, reached out to Karzai, the Taliban leadership. And they worked out an agreement to surrender the remaining Taliban provinces under Taliban control, which was in southern and eastern Afghanistan, in return for amnesty. And Karzai actually announced the deal. He announced on, I think it was December 6th, the Taliban had agreed to surrender. And he said at the time, and this is important, he said, the Afghan Taliban are our brothers, and there's no cause for them to worry. Let there be no revenge and no vendetta. He even suggested that former Taliban officials could play a role in the new Afghan government. But at the very least, he said they could live in dignity in Afghanistan. And that deal, however, quickly fell apart. And the reason why it fell apart, I mean, there was opposition among some of Karzai's political allies in Northern Alliance, but the biggest reason it failed was because U.S. officials opposed it. Now, we spent a lot of time over the past several months trying to decipher precisely what role U.S. officials played. Did they play a direct role in spiking this surrender agreement? And at this point, we're still sort of trying to suss that out. But indirectly, there's simply no question that the U.S. officials actively opposed this deal and made every effort to prevent a Taliban surrender from occurring. They publicly stated that they would not accept a surrender of the Taliban. They wanted these folks to go on trial. And they would not accept the idea of Mullah Omar and other top Taliban officials living in Afghanistan in dignity. And you can see this in the comments of then Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld. And if you look at it, and in November, maybe 2 or 3 weeks before the Taliban were defeated, he talked about this issue, an issue of a surrender, an issue of what would come next if the Taliban were defeated, in almost a detached way. He sort of spoke of it as though this was a decision that Afghans would make on their own. By early December, he had changed his tone. And he said very clearly that the U.S. rejected the idea of Omar remaining in Afghanistan in dignity. Again, he used those words. And even went so far as to suggest that the U.S. would find other Afghan allies if the Karzai, the new government, pursued a surrender agreement or surrender or reconciliation with the Taliban. I mean, openly threatened them and said that this would be unacceptable to U.S. officials. Not surprisingly, within about 24 hours of Karzai's initial agreement, his rhetoric changed as well. He now declared that high-ranking Taliban officials must face trial. And over the next several weeks and months, the U.S. position on this continued. They continued to publicly state their position that there was no room for reconciliation with the Taliban. And they pursued this policy over the next 18 months until the Taliban insurgency began to reemerge. One of the more famous examples of this was a Taliban foreign minister came to CIA officials in Kandahar, this is in 2002, offered to surrender, proposed establishing a political party in Kandahar that would even be allied with Karzai. His reward was that he was arrested and sent to Guantanamo Bay. So if you're wondering why this was the U.S. position, in our research, we interviewed a number of Bush administration officials, and we spoke with Doug Feith, who was the Undersecretary of Defense for Policy. And he said something that is, I'm going to quote here because it's pretty helpful to explain what the U.S. position was. He said the U.S. wanted to, quote, remove the Taliban government as a way of communicating to state sponsors of terrorism that there are very heavy penalties to be paid for being associated with the groups that attack the United States. So this is very similar to what Chris talked about, viewing Afghanistan as abstraction. As far as the Bush administration was concerned, defeating the Taliban was more than just about what happened in Afghanistan. It was about sending a message to other countries in the region, other leaders in the region who were thinking about sponsoring terrorists or thinking about supporting terrorists who would then attack the United States. So the U.S. had no interest in really what happened in Afghanistan. They had interest in protecting, in what they thought was protecting the U.S. from terrorism and sending this message. And I really think it's hard to underestimate the importance of this decision, this viewpoint, which permeated the highest levels of the Bush administration. There's a lot of debate on Afghanistan when you get into this kind of the weeds here. What's the original sin of the U.S. war in Afghanistan? There's lots of different theories on what this is. In my view, this is the original sin. This was the biggest mistake that the U.S. made, was failing to try to win the peace. A surrender agreement would have basically ended the Taliban's claims to be the government of Afghanistan. And that's not a minor point. For years afterwards, Taliban officials consistently denied that this surrender ever occurred. Because to acknowledge it would be to acknowledge that they had willingly given up their right or their claim to be the rightful government of Afghanistan. A Taliban surrender would have reassured Taliban fighters, Taliban mid-level officials, that they had nothing to fear from a Karzai government. And they would have been invested in Afghanistan's future. They would have been, I'm not going to use the full quote here, they would have been inside the tent. And instead they were outside the tent. You know the rest of that goes. And from a security standpoint, it would have smoothed the path for nation building because it would have put a formal end to military hostilities. Now, in the period after December 2001, there were not open military hostilities. The Taliban were basically defeated force, and the top leaders who were still interested in fighting had crossed the border into Pakistan. Again, most of the fighters had gone back to their communities. But it would have ensured an end to military hostilities that perhaps would have been sustained. That didn't happen. Now, some of you may say, well, you know, were the Taliban really going to surrender? Were they really going to work with the Karzai government? And one thing that I think is underappreciated about Afghanistan, there's a very rich history of vanquished powers jumping to the front of the parade, if you will, and joining forces with a group that just ousted them. That's why you have former communists who would end up joining the Taliban. And in this case, actually, it's always a fun thing that I like to do. Anybody know where Hamid Karzai lives right now? Yeah. He lives in Kabul. Very good. Get that man a gold star. He lives in Kabul. Now, how many years Taliban tried to kill Karzai? Many years tried to kill him. But he now lives in Kabul. This is not unusual. There are exceptions. What happened to Najibullah, if you know what happened to him, that was an obvious exception to the basic rule here. But in general, there is a tradition of vanquished parties joining forces, or at least accommodating themselves to new leadership in the country. We did not allow that to occur. And in large part because the U.S. was really wedded to the view that the Al-Qaeda and the Taliban were interchangeable. Okay, on the day after 9/11, actually, I'm sorry, the night of 9/11, at a National Security Council meeting, CIA Director George Tenet said to the president that the Taliban and Al-Qaeda are one and the same. This was not true. They had very different goals, very different aspirations. One was an Afghan group. The other was a primarily Arab terrorist group. Al-Qaeda, their focus was on international jihad. The Taliban's focus was on Afghanistan. They had very different goals, and the view remained that they were interchangeable. And because of that, the U.S. refused to show any leniency or create a path for Taliban reintegration. And that viewpoint, again, would have a very dangerous catalytic effect. And there is this notion that you'll hear, even to this day, that the U.S. failed in Afghanistan because we took our eyes off the ball and we invaded Iraq. Now, I'm not going to sit here and defend the invasion of Iraq. And by the way, this is an argument that you heard quite prominently from President Obama when he ran for office in 2008. And he consistently would say that we took our eyes off the ball, we ignored what was happening in Afghanistan and focused on Iraq. This lets U.S. officials off the hook. Because the U.S. failure in Afghanistan in 2002 and 2003 was not a crime of omission, it was a crime of commission. We took very specific actions that doomed our effort there. And as we put it in the title of our paper, snatched defeat from the jaws of victory. And again, these were rooted in the same misplaced assumptions that drove U.S. decision-making that Chris talked about in the days and weeks after 9/11. And again, no assumption would cast a larger shadow on U.S. policy than this conflation of Al-Qaeda and the Taliban. Okay? After Operation Anaconda, which happened in March of 2002, which was the last sort of major set-piece battle that the U.S. fought in Afghanistan, they really wiped out most of the significant Al-Qaeda presence in the country. Al-Qaeda did not have a strong presence in the country after 9/11, and certainly after Operation Anaconda, which happened in March 2002, just a few months after the Taliban defeat. But that did not stop the U.S. from waging an aggressive counterterrorism campaign against the remnants of the Taliban. And in that single-minded pursuit of the Taliban, the U.S. made a lot of really bad decisions that helped contribute to the insurgency that would eventually emerge. First of all, they allied themselves with Afghanistan's warlords. Okay, these were a rapacious set of actors who took advantage of the U.S. To strengthen their own positions and target their political, tribal, and business rivals. And the warlords had been responsible for so much of the country's violence in the early 90s, I should say probably the mid-90s. And the civil war that emerged between them, this is after the defeat of the communist regime. There was a terrible fighting that went on between the warlords, and that's actually what led to the Taliban emergence, was their response to the violence spurred on by the nation's warlords. And we basically went and worked with them because they were the only actors, frankly, who had guns, and we thought could help us identify Taliban officials. But what they'd often do is they would identify individuals who were rivals of theirs, business rivals, tribal rivals, political rivals, what have you. And they would use us as a tool for attacking their enemies. We were basically played. And support for the warlords also badly undermined the legitimacy of the Karzai government, because the Karzai government appeared weak and feckless and unable to provide services, and also, evoke some Max Weber here, the monopoly of force, which was supposed to be with the Karzai government, was actually with these warlords. And also, by relying on the wars, the United States inserted themselves into these countries' complex tribal and local rivalries. You know, there was a very interesting element of the debate in the U.S. that we didn't want to get involved in Afghanistan. We didn't want to get involved in nation building. And yet, what we were doing by working with these warlords is we were inserting ourselves into these battles, even if we didn't realize it. And we didn't realize it. And our presence would spark tensions over access to aid dollars. Military expenditures are flowing into the country. And rather than bringing security to the country, they actually contributed to insecurity. This creates a really bizarre paradox, which is that the more insecurity there was, the better it was for the warlords, right? Because if there's insecurity, then we need the warlords more. We need them to help defeat whatever's causing this insecurity. And there's documented incidents of the warlords manufacturing incidents in order to use the U.S. as a tool against their rivals. So our presence, if anything, contributed to insecurity in the country. And you see this. There's lots of documented evidence of this. And what's interesting about this also is that in the places where we did not have troops, things were relatively calm and relatively stable. But the places where we were, and this is mostly in the north and west of the country and in Kabul itself. But elsewhere, in the south and the east, where our troops were, that was causing instability. And because we were so focused on the Taliban and going after them, going after the remnants of Al-Qaeda and so forth, we also resisted calls for a national peacekeeping force. There was a peacekeeping force. It was only in Kabul. Eventually, we would agree to expand it. By that point, it became almost too late. One of the reasons we opposed a peacekeeping force is because we feared that it would interfere with our efforts to go after the Taliban. That's why we didn't want that. And the final thing is that our strategy, this counterterrorism strategy, alienated the Afghan people. And I can't make this point enough that there was a real outpouring of support for the U.S., in part because the Afghans didn't really fear us. They didn't see us like the Soviets, who were neighbors they thought might take over their country. We were from thousands of miles away. We weren't seen as a threat by most of the Afghan civilians. Only as time went on were we seen as a threat, because wherever we went, death and destruction would often follow. And it's kind of counterintuitive, because there's a notion that the Afghan people always resist foreigners. Right? This is sort of the stereotype about Afghans. It was not true when it came to the U.S. presence. And so that also, not having a peacekeeping force around the country, contributed to a lack of security. And that lack of security, you can really look at almost every problem that emerged in Afghanistan: the lack of economic development, disenchantment with the Karzai government, the reemergence of the narco economy there. All of these were in some ways related to lack of security and the fact that we failed to provide security. And so in the end, basically what we forgot is this sort of basic scientific truism that for every action there's an equal and opposite reaction. And by pursuing this aggressive counterterrorism strategy based on this false assumption and false conflation of Taliban and Al-Qaeda, it created a fearsome backlash. And by 2003, 2004, had laid the foundation for a Taliban insurgency to reemerge. So at that, I'm going to finish up, and we'll take your questions. Thank you.
So I think the modus vivendi here is that questions will be coming down on note cards. And do people in the audience know where to pass those questions? Are the ambassadors going around? You know, they're in the very striking blue sports blazers. Excellent. So if you have a question, please notify, give them your cards. And I'm going to use my prerogative up here as the questions come down to make a recommendation and ask a question.
Sure.
The recommendation is, we care about this case because we want to think about the future. You know, the Army has its Center for Lessons Learned, and I think in general policymakers should look at both Iraq and Afghanistan. And you know, after Vietnam, we said we weren't going to do this again. That turned out to be wrong. So we said after Iraq and Afghanistan, we wouldn't do this again. We'll probably do it again. So we need to know what to do right. And I think I'd like to hear in future presentations, even in the draft of the paper, what we should have done as a counterfactual. Instead of the negative case, here are the things you've done wrong, but just a positive case. Because then I can look at not just Afghanistan, but look at Iraq and say, okay, is that the path we should have taken? So to that end, let me ask you my question, which is when you think about strategy, of course, it's matching means to ends. And if I understand your short story, to summarize, because I worked for Rumsfeld and we wrote simple memos with 1 pages and a few bullet points.
I've seen many of them. Yeah.
We used to call them snowflakes.
Yeah.
But the conventional story about what went wrong in Afghanistan is that we didn't use sufficient means or the process was broken. I think your story is we got the objectives incorrectly, either because they were too ambitious or they were wrong. Is that your story? Is that the problem was not on the means or process side of strategy, but on the objective or the end side?
Well, I certainly think that the decision to go after the Taliban as though they were one and the same with Al-Qaeda was a particular end. It was not often thought that way, because again, if you think that these two organizations are joined at the hip, if they are in fact one and the same, then the end of eradicating terrorism, no one's going to quarrel with that. Of course, we were attacked on 9/11. Of course we're going to go after the people responsible for 9/11. But the problem is that the Taliban, especially rank and file Taliban, weren't responsible for the attacks on 9/11. Many of them had no particular affinity for Al-Qaeda at all. And so that was a objective, that a different objective, focusing on Al-Qaeda, would have led to a very, very different conflict. Because by, as Mike points out, by March of 2002, the Al-Qaeda presence in Afghanistan was effectively gone, and certainly scattered. But meanwhile, the Taliban, the remnants of the Taliban, and people were using that knowing that the United States was looking for terrorists, AKA Taliban. Show me where the terrorists are. Oh, that guy over there, he's a terrorist. He's a Taliban guy.
I almost think you're saying if we were less black and white,
Yes.
and if we had more realpolitik, and we were willing to get into bed with the Taliban, better things would have happened?
No. A better understanding of Afghanistan. A better understanding. To answer your earlier question, Jason, is what to do right, first and foremost, know the country in which you are operating. We did not know Iraq either, right? Or what we knew about Iraq was told to us by people that hadn't lived there in decades. That was a problem.
Yeah, yes. So one of the issues the problems that we had in Afghanistan was that we never took seriously Afghans' opinions or Afghan viewpoints. So to put it different, so take for example this, we asked this question actually to Fife, and we said there must have been situations in which U.S. national security interests came in conflict with Afghan interests, political interests, domestic political interests. And he said, yeah, that would happen, and he basically acknowledged that in those situations, U.S. national security interests won out. We put our interests first. That makes sense from one level, but it also doesn't mean that you're going to see success in Afghanistan. So yes, it was in our interests. We thought it was in our interests to pursue the Taliban and to make them pay a price and to send a message. But from the Afghan perspective, that really wasn't helpful to them and wasn't helpful to the creating a functioning democracy, or certainly even
state.
I'm sorry, thank you, a functioning state.
Right.
So Karzai was consistently, tried to pursue the path of reconciliation with the Taliban and was consistently rebuffed in that effort. Right? He consistently asked to extend the peacekeeping force that was in Kabul to the rest of the country, as by the way did some U.S. officials. And we mentioned Richard Haas, he's one. Other officials did that as well. He was rebuffed in that because ultimately we saw that as interfering with what we were trying to accomplish from a counterterrorism perspective. So each time that we were faced with these sort of clash between our interests and their interests, we chose our interests. And ultimately that doomed our effort in Afghanistan because we didn't really care, to be honest, what happened to Afghanistan. We just saw it as a place to fight Al-Qaeda. And to answer your question a different way also, we never really questioned the assumptions. So one of the reasons we got involved in this was in 2009 or 10 during the surge, I started writing about this, and I kept seeing this assumption that we have to be in Afghanistan because if the Taliban come back, they will create a safe haven for Al-Qaeda. And I remember at the time thinking, that doesn't really make a lot of sense. Why would the Taliban do that? Why would they basically pursue the exact same path that led to the end of their rule of Afghanistan? And the more you look into it, the more you understand there was a huge swath of the Taliban leadership that did not want bin Laden to be in the country, that did not want Al-Qaeda to be in the country, that they saw these as something that was actually undermining their larger political goals. That assumption that we cannot allow Taliban to come back because Al-Qaeda will have a safe haven was never questioned. It was literally used as justification in 2009 when Obama surged U.S. troops there. I was still hearing it in 2021 when we left. And guess what? It's been 2 years since the Taliban took over the country. You know what hasn't showed up in Afghanistan? An Al-Qaeda safe haven. So that assumption was just never questioned. And over again, these assumptions just became part of the narrative about Afghanistan that went unquestioned. And so how do you not take a mistake again? Is that you actually question your assumptions.
All right, first question from the audience, and it's a doozy, so I hope you're ready.
Here we go. Okay.
Given what you presented, comma, wasn't pulling out so suddenly the wrong thing to do?
Oh boy. Oh boy.
Shouldn't we have
Jump right to the
changed
chase.
our approach while staying there to help the people and the economy? Yeah, I think you're on the hook for that one.
Okay.
Yeah.
I'll take that first, and I know Michael has thoughts on this too.
Just a few.
The argument that the United States could have stayed in Afghanistan for another 20 years with the same size forces we had in 2018 or 2019 ignores two critical facts. First of all, that the decline in attacks on the United States, especially after the Doha Agreement, was a function of the Doha Agreement, the agreement that the United States would withdraw forces within a certain time, and that the attacks on U.S. forces declined to zero during that time period. That was only possible with the commitment, the promise to leave, and that if the United States reneged on that commitment, then the Taliban would have resumed attacks on U.S. forces in the country, whether that was a few thousand or tens of thousands. The second problem with the argument that a small force in Afghanistan could have remained indefinitely ignores what happened in Afghanistan from roughly 2012 to 2019 or 2020, which is that progressively, over that period of time, Taliban control over territory in Afghanistan grew and grew and grew. And so you only can argue that the United States could have stayed in Afghanistan indefinitely if you believe that the Taliban was not increasing their hold of the territory in that 8-year period. The evidence doesn't show that at all. So I don't agree with the argument that the United States could have remained in Afghanistan indefinitely, and most importantly, that the United States should have remained in Afghanistan indefinitely, because by that time, the mission no longer served core U.S. national interests.
Yeah, I want to pick up on that point because I think that's exactly the point. Let's say we had stayed. What U.S. national security interest would have been furthered by us staying? Now, granted, not having the Taliban in power is a positive thing. I'm not going to sit here and defend the Taliban rule. I'm definitely not going to do that. But from a core U.S. national security perspective, how has it undermined our U.S. national security interests the Taliban are in power today versus the Ghani government that was there beforehand? And I have a hard time making the argument that this has severely undermined U.S. national security interests. You know, the justification for us staying there was counterterrorism. I struggle to see how our ability to confront terrorism has been weakened or significantly affected by our departure from Afghanistan. And to Chris's point, you know, I just think we need to be clear that when people say we should have stayed in Afghanistan, they're basically saying they were okay with American troops continuing to be at risk and continuing to to being killed by the Taliban. That's what would have happened had we stayed. Now, maybe it was a very small number, and it probably would have been a very small number, but those lives matter, obviously. And we have to think about, was that price worth paying? And I don't believe that it was worth paying. And frankly, if after 20 years and the most expensive war in U.S. history could not stand up an effective government that could rule the country on its own, when was that ever going to happen? So it's hard for me to see the justification for remaining there to continue a mission that was clearly doomed to fail.
I'm going to ask two questions I think are related, although they're slightly different, but they're about public perceptions and policy. The first is, I like this one, how can the U.S. learn from its mistakes when there is no accountability process to hold the administration accountable? I mean, when I think about the run-up to the Iraq War, there were lots of cheerleaders. It was only Fareed Zakaria that did a 1-hour mea culpa on CNN. So I think this is an important question. Another related question, how does one effectively change framing options used by policy people? Or the same frames that they use to promote policies among the public?
Right. You want me to take, well,
On the accountability.
And let's be
You wanna take
concise, because we have
accountability?
8 minutes.
okay, fine. So you take accountability.
Okay.
So I'm going to answer the second question first. How to change the framing options. This is why testing assumptions is so critical. Assumptions are critical to decision making, right? You cannot operate in your life if you don't operate around certain assumptions. But the equally critical thing to do is to revisit those assumptions, especially when you take an action based on a certain set of assumptions. You expect that action to produce a specific effect. When that effect doesn't occur, then check the assumptions, right? That is absolutely critical. I think the most important, we've talked about the importance of the assumption that Al-Qaeda and the Taliban were the same. That was a critical assumption. Equally important and related was the assumption that a Taliban government or a Taliban sympathetic government would be equally sympathetic to hosting the Al-Qaeda as they did prior to 9/11. That was an assumption that should have been tested, could have been tested, was queried at the time of the 2009-2010 surge, but ultimately was one of the rationales that maintained the mission years after many people had concluded that it was never going to succeed.
On the accountability question, look, this is kind of why we created this project, was because we felt that there needed to be some accountability for the mistakes we made. I mean, Afghanistan has become kind of like the red-headed stepchild of American wars. Nobody wants to talk about it. It's become completely forgotten. It's just sort of like it happened and it's ignored, even though it was honestly, one of the worst defeats that we ever experienced as a country. It was a 20-year disaster that ended up exactly back from where it was before the war started with the Taliban in power, at a loss of trillions of dollars that we will continue to pay for years afterward, and at a loss of thousands of American lives, not to mention hundreds of thousands of Afghan lives. So that's why part of why we're doing this, because this war needs to be focused and looked at it with greater granularity. There isn't right now an Afghan War Commission that was created. Actually, Liz Cheney was responsible for putting a rider into the National Defense Authorization Act that created this. They have begun work. We do coordinate with them. We're sort of separate from them, but we think the work they're doing is important. And we hope that will lead to some accountability. But there has not been even within the military any kind of after action report you mentioned before about what went wrong in Afghanistan. And it's very troubling, because after Vietnam, there was that kind of after action, or at least there was a soul searching within the military about what went wrong. And you could look at some of the things like the Weinberger Doctrine, the Powell Doctrine, that kind of came out of that from really pushed by the military to not allow something like Vietnam to happen again. There's not been the same thing in Afghanistan, and frankly, it hasn't been on Iraq either, to a large extent. So this is a process that we hope our project will help spur a little bit of a look back as to why these wars occurred, and also we hope that the Commission does that as well. But this has unfortunately become one of the byproducts of the war on terrorism and the 20 years that we experienced after 9/11, that it's almost become like a forgotten period of American history. And the mistakes that were made there have become somewhat forgotten. Now, I will say this, maybe one positive about this is that we have, I do think that at least our current president, to his credit, opposed the surge in Afghanistan in 2009. He was against it, and he, I think, deserves enormous credit, actually, for pulling out of Afghanistan when 3 other presidents couldn't do it. He ended a war. It doesn't happen very often like the way that it did, and he did it, to his credit. So I think that's a positive thing. And I think there's also a general sense that we don't want to get ourselves involved in kinds of wars again. But as you said, that was the attitude after Vietnam, and guess what? We did it again 20 years later. Not 20 years, I guess 30 years later. And I think, without learning these lessons, we could make the same mistakes again that we made in Afghanistan and Iraq. And hopefully that's one of the things this project will do is help policymakers understand what they got wrong and help them question the assumptions that led them down this road in the first place.
One of the puzzles in Vietnam, Iraq, and Afghanistan is how do you build an army from largely scratch
Yes.
that can provide security a la Max Weber,
Yes.
provide a legitimate monopoly of violence within a piece of territory.
Yes.
And in both Vietnam, Iraq, and Afghanistan, would you agree we largely failed to build a success? The Iraqi military collapses in the face of ISIS.
Right.
Yes.
Without American air support, the South Vietnamese army collapses, and the Afghan military did not fight like the Ukrainians.
Correct.
That's right.
That's right.
That's to put it mildly. Yes.
Yeah.
They didn't fight at all.
A question about the State Department. What does a revitalized State Department look like, given your criticisms of the State Department's role in Afghanistan? This is asking you to wave a magic wand and a fiat and make it so.
Well, I think one of the things that the Afghanistan war highlights, and I think also the Iraq war highlights, especially Afghanistan, is the predominant role the U.S. military plays in American foreign policy, and often how damaging that is. One of the things we've been struck by, especially in that early period of the war, is how little the State Department was involved in these deliberations. I talk about the surrender issue, and I've spent a lot of time looking at this question, how directly a role the U.S. played in scuttling this. One thing I have not been able to find is any evidence the State Department played a huge role in this. And you would think
A role, not a huge role.
I'm sorry.
A role.
That's actually fair.
Period.
Yeah, it's there. A role. Which is kind of crazy because that's the diplomatic wing of the United States government, right? And yet it's hard to find these decisions about how to treat the Taliban, what would come after the Taliban rule, was really being made at the Defense Department, and from what we can tell, largely being made by Donald Rumsfeld. Now that's partly personality, who Rumsfeld was. Jason can talk more about that. I mean, it's partly who he is as a person, and his desire to impose his sort of worldview and his view of what the U.S. military should do on Afghanistan. But the State Department was really put to the side, and that I think is both a function of Pentagon having a bigger budget, Pentagon having more influence, but it's also a function of personality of the president themselves and who the president is. And George Bush didn't really push back, at least until 2006, I would say. Is that right? On Pentagon playing the sort of predominant role, and he didn't push back on sort of Rumsfeld driving that policy. And I think that it's very hard to sort of to diminish the Pentagon's role in these kinds of things. At the very least, you can hope you can teach them to be able to handle these sort of things better, although I don't know that that's even possible.
Yeah, I mean, I wrote about this many years ago at the time when State was trying to stand up a more thoroughgoing state-building effort. But it does, a key factor is the ability to operate in a secure environment, and therefore you need someone providing that security to allow the people wearing the fancy suit like you are to do their work, right?
I got it on sale.
And it's a really nice suit, Jason. I mean, you really are. You're straight out of Foggy Bottom in that suit. I got to call it out.
I don't have the cufflinks.
Yeah, no
That's true, you
cufflinks.
need the cufflinks.
But I mean,
Yeah, you need the
so
cufflinks,
this is a conundrum, right? This is a paradox. You want your diplomats to be able to operate in a particular place, but they need to do so within a modicum of security. Who provides that security? Now, if you're in a post-conflict environment and there is a peace settlement, for example, and you've established who is providing that security, then you have an answer. They're operating in a secure environment. But that wasn't the case in Afghanistan, at least for a good part of the time. One last thing, we should mention this. I want to emphasize this point, because this was a surprise to me. In the critical period, 2002 and into 2003, there was no Taliban insurgency in Afghanistan. Yeah. There were some sort of halting efforts on the part of some of the Taliban dead-enders, like Omar and a handful of folks who really wanted to fight, and they went back to their base of operations in the South in particular, South and East, and they tried to rally opposition to the United States, and they failed. It didn't work. So they ran away. Only after the United States' counterterrorism mission resulted in some very unfortunate, unintended deaths and arrests of people who were innocent of terrorism, that was where they started to find fertile ground for resuming, for starting up.
It would be really useful if you could find a historical example of what we should have done and why it worked and compare it to Afghanistan. But my suspicion
there aren't many.
Is there are not many.
There are not many.
Let me say one more thing about this too. And one of the things that really struck us about this is that we're not very good at ending wars in the U.S. Right. And I mean that sincerely. I think there's a mindset that says that that sort of dates from World War II was the way you win a war is you vanquish your enemy, and they surrender formally, and then it's a complete and total victory. Where we struggle with is how do we end a war that doesn't look like that. And so I think and that actually is a question that I think will be asked about Russia and Ukraine at some point.
Yes.
So this isn't just about Afghanistan. This is also how do you end a war in a way that satisfies all sides that may not be satisfying. And so in Afghanistan, can I say with certainty that had we accepted the Taliban surrender and how we allowed them to reconcile, that there would have been no uncertainty? No, I cannot say that with certainty. But I think there's a lot of good evidence to suggest that it was a better course of action than the one that we took. And I think this, and I do understand, by the way, and for those of you who were alive at the time or very young, there was a lot of desire for vengeance after 9/11, and it would have been a politically difficult thing to do. I think we have to acknowledge that. But the failure to consider this possibility of sort of reintegration, or at least to not target the Taliban as aggressively as we did, was again, it was partly because of I think how feelings were rather raw after 9/11, but it was a mistake, and it's one that we made and we continued to make for many years after 2001. And in fact, look, as I said, Chris is right. During the emerged 2003, there were plenty of opportunities, plenty of motions when Taliban officials tried to surrender, and we still rejected it. And by that point, the political cost would have been much less than they would have been, say, in December of 2001, had we allowed that to occur. So I just think that that's a good lesson to take away from this, is that sometimes you have to just take half a loaf or 3/4 of a loaf when you end a war, because that's the best path forward to win the peace.
Well, in addition to their paper, which there are a few copies,
and you can access both papers are posted on the Center for Strategic Studies website at the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy at Tufts University. So you can access that. The card that I showed you has a QR code on it that you can go to and find our website and all of our materials, find out more about ourselves and the researchers that are part of this project, as well as our expert steering committee who's been really critical to this project from the very beginning.
I recommend the paper. I also recommend Freddie Clay's book, Every War Must End.
Every War Must End.
My students like it because it's very thin, but it's a very important book. Yes. Let's thank Chris and Michael.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, sir.